It's funny, isn't it? The things you think you know. You build this whole reality around assumptions, the quiet nods in the hallway, the fence you share, that cup of sugar you borrowed once. My neighbor, Mr. Abernathy, was, to me, just predictable, a fixture of quiet suburban life. And then he returned my book. Such a simple thing, almost unnoticeable, but what was tucked inside that book, nestled between pages I'd once skimmed through, didn't just unravel a story. It unraveled him. And in doing that, it unraveled a piece of my own world, a piece I never even realized was so loosely stitched together. What I stumbled upon wasn't just unexpected. It was like a whisper from a darkness I had no idea was living right next door. Mr. Abernathy. Arthur Abernathy. Even his name sounded like something out of a gentle old children's book. He lived in the house to my left, a neat two-story colonial. The white trim was always perfect, and his flower boxes, even in the dead heat of late summer, always seemed to be overflowing with these unnervingly bright petunias. He was a creature of habit, a man of quiet routines. Up early, newspaper off the porch by 6:05 a.m. sharp. Lawn mowed every Saturday at 9:30 a.m. if the weather was good. If it rained, he'd wait until the next Saturday, not Sunday, never Sunday. I'd guess he was in his late 60s, maybe early 70s. His hair was snow white, always neatly combed, though getting a bit thin on top. He had a thing for cardigans, even when it wasn't really cardigan weather. He walked with this slow, deliberate shuffle. Maybe he was just careful, or maybe his joints had seen better days. We weren't friends, not really. Our chats were the usual neighborly stuff. A nod over the azaleas, a quick word about the weather when we got our mail, the occasional wave if one of us was pulling out of the driveway. His voice was quiet, a little reedy, and his smile was polite, but never quite reached his pale blue eyes. Those eyes? Sometimes I thought they were like looking at a winter sky, clear, distant, and definitely holding something back. I'd lived next to him for 5 years. In all that time, I'd learned almost nothing about his personal life. No visitors, aside from the mailman or a delivery driver now and then. No loud parties. No late nights. His house was this island of quiet in a street that usually hummed with the normal chaos of families, dogs barking, and teenagers learning to drive. Sometimes, his silence felt less like peace and more like an absence, a carefully kept vacuum. But hey, who was I to judge? Some people are just private. That's what I told myself. People who are good at keeping secrets, skeletons in the closet and all that, they just get better at it when things go sideways. The book he'd borrowed was a pretty unremarkable collection of short stories, moderately well-known author. I'd found it in a used bookstore a year or so before, read it, liked it, and then it just sat on my shelf. About 3 months back, we had one of our brief chats over the fence. He was admiring a rose bush I was struggling with, and somehow, we got onto the topic of reading. He mentioned, in a rare moment of actually sharing something, that he used to like whodunits but hadn't read a book in years. On a whim, maybe feeling a bit of connection, I offered to lend him something. Not exactly a whodunit, I'd said, holding out the collection, but some interesting characters. You might like it. He took it with this hesitant smile, his papery fingers brushing mine for a split second. "That's very kind of you," he'd murmured, his eyes flicking down to the cover, then back to my face. "I'll take good care of it." And then nothing. Weeks went by, then months. I'd honestly forgotten about the book, or at least it was on that mental list of things I've lent out and might never see again. I wasn't fussed. It wasn't some rare first edition, just a paperback. If anything, I'd occasionally see Mr. Abernathy in his yard and feel this tiny, almost unnoticeable twinge of awkwardness. That feeling you get from an unfinished social thing, no matter how small. But I never brought it up. It didn't seem worth disturbing his carefully built quiet. Then came that Tuesday, an aggressively ordinary Tuesday. The sky was this bland, washed-out blue. The air was thick, promising that heavy afternoon humidity. I was out front, wrestling with a stubborn garden hose, trying to get it coiled neatly, when I heard his familiar slow shuffle on the driveway. He was holding the book. "Ah, good morning," I said, straightening up, a little surprised. Not so much about the book, but more that he was starting an interaction beyond a simple nod. "Good morning," he replied, his voice its usual low, slightly gravelly monotone. He held the book out. "I wanted to return this, thank you for the loan, it was quite engaging." "Oh, right. No problem at all, Mr. Abernathy, I'm glad you enjoyed it." I took the book. One corner of the cover was a bit dog-eared, a sign it had been read. It felt a little warm, like he'd been holding it for a while. "Yes," he said. His eyes flicked towards my house, then back to me. The stories, they had a certain depth. He paused, like he was searching for the right word, but then just seemed to let it go. "Well, thank you again." And with another polite, almost invisible nod, he turned and shuffled back towards his own perfect walkway. The silence settled back in his wake almost instantly. I stood there for a second, book in hand, the garden hose forgotten. A totally normal, utterly mundane exchange. A neighbor returning a borrowed book. Nothing more to it. I remember glancing at the cover, some vague abstract design in blues and grays. It looked just like it had when I lent it to him, maybe a little more worn, a bit more handled. I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? He'd borrowed it, read it, presumably, and returned it. End of story. Or so I thought. I took it inside, put it on the little table in the entryway, planning to put it back on its shelf later. It sat there for the rest of the day, just an ordinary object, paper and glue. If I'd known then what secrets it held, what horrors it had silently soaked up, I would have tossed it in the nearest fire. But I didn't know. I went about my Tuesday, blissfully, terrifyingly, unaware. That ordinary, impenetrable shield of normalcy was still firmly in place. It was later that evening. Dinner dishes were done, the sun had set, painting the sky in these bruised purples and faded oranges, and the house was settling into its nightly quiet. I was in the living room, flicking through channels, a half-empty mug of herbal tea cooling on the coaster next to me. My eyes drifted to the entryway table where the book still lay. Just put it back on the shelf, I thought. Get it out of the way. I picked it up. The cover, like I'd noticed earlier, was a bit more creased. The spine had those telltale cracks from being opened wide, maybe more than once. Mr. Abernathy, it seemed, really had given it a thorough read. A small, almost fond smile touched my lips. It's nice when a lent book is actually appreciated, actually read, instead of just becoming another forgotten thing on a dusty nightstand. I wasn't planning on reading it again, not then. I just meant to walk it over to the bookshelf in my study. But as I held it, this almost unconscious habit took over. You know, the habit of a lifelong reader. I fanned the pages lightly with my thumb, that soft shh of paper, a familiar comfort. It was purely tactile, a mindless gesture. That's when I first felt it, or rather didn't feel it. There was a slight unevenness, a subtle thickness, not enough to be obvious, not like a bookmark left carelessly behind. This was different. It was like some of the pages weren't lying as flat as they should. Like something was nestled inside, something thin, but definitely there. Curiosity, that nagging human trait, tugged at me. Still standing in the living room, I let the book fall open in my hands, roughly in the middle where I'd sensed the oddness. My eyes scanned the pages, expecting maybe a pressed flower, a forgotten receipt. The kind of harmless stuff that often ends up in the pages of a well-traveled book. The page I'd opened to was nothing special. Standard text paragraphs marching neatly across the paper. But then I noticed it. A faint indentation. Not a fold, but a pressure mark. Like something had been resting heavily on that page for a long time. And beneath the black ink of the printed words, almost invisible unless the light hit it just right, was a faint, spidery line of writing. My heart did a little flutter like a startled bird in a cage. This wasn't my handwriting, it wasn't part of the book. I tilted the book towards the lamp. the light casting weird shadows. The writing was tiny, almost microscopic, squeezed into the white space between the printed lines and in the margins. It was a pale blue ink, the color of a faded robin's egg, and the script was incredibly precise, cramped and angular. It looked meticulous, obsessive even. For a moment I just stared. It was so unexpected. Mr. Abernathy? Quiet, reserved Mr. Abernathy? A guy who scribbled all over borrowed books? It just didn't fit. His perfect garden, his rigid routines, they didn't scream, man who defaces other people's property. My first thought was mild annoyance. It's one thing to dog-ear a page, but writing in a book that isn't yours? But the annoyance was quickly pushed aside by this growing intrigue. What could he possibly have found so compelling in these particular stories to write such detailed notes? I flipped a few more pages. The annotations weren't on every page. They showed up here and there, clustered around certain stories, certain passages. And the more I looked, the more I realized these weren't just casual notes or observations. There was a focus to them, a disturbing intensity. I sat down on the sofa, the TV now just a forgotten drone in the background. My tea was definitely cold. I began to read the annotations, not the story printed by the publisher, but the secret narrative woven between its lines by my neighbor. The first few I managed to make out were cryptic. Single words mostly. Predictable. Weak. She deserved it. That last one, she deserved it, was written next to a passage where a female character in one of the stories had some minor misfortune. It was unsettling, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just critiquing the plot, the character development. People see things differently, right? But as I flipped further, my casual flip through turning into a more focused, if hesitant, exploration, the nature of the notes began to change. They became less about the book's story and more personal, reflective. And these reflections weren't from a kind, gentle soul. They were sharp, bitter, and laced with this chilling sort of detachment. My fingers, I realized, were trembling slightly as I turned a page. The air in the room suddenly felt colder, or maybe it was just me. That faint, almost imperceptible sense of something being off that I'd occasionally felt around Mr. Abernathy, that feeling I'd always dismissed as my own overactive imagination, began to sharpen. It was no longer just a vague unease. It was the beginning of a very specific, very targeted dread. The book in my hands no longer felt like a collection of stories. It felt like a container, a vessel holding something dark, something that had seeped into its very fibers. And I had just pried the lid open. That spidery blue script was tough to read, not just because it was so tiny, but because the words were often crammed together. It looked like they were written in a rush, or maybe by a hand trying to hold back some powerful emotion. I found myself leaning closer, the book just inches from my face, the smell of old paper and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling, filling my nostrils. One story in particular, a rather sad tale about a woman feeling isolated in her marriage, seemed to have really grabbed Mr. Abernathy's attention. The margins around this story were packed with his tiny, angular writing. Phrases leaped out at me, disconnected but stark. The pretense of innocence. Always the victim. She manipulates with tears. Silence is her weapon. My breath hitched. This wasn't literary criticism. This felt personal. Angry. It was as if the character in the story had become a stand-in for someone real, someone who had made Mr. Abernathy deeply resentful. The tone was cold, analytical, yet practically vibrating with this suppressed anger you could almost feel. I remembered his wife, Mrs. Abernathy. I hadn't seen her in years. When I first moved in, she was this quiet presence. You'd sometimes see her tending the roses or sitting on their porch swing. She was even more withdrawn than he was, with this perpetually worried look on her face. Then, about 2 years after I moved in, she just disappeared. One day she was there. The next, the house seemed emptier, the porch swing still. No explanations given. No moving truck ever showed up. When I'd cautiously asked another more established neighbor, Mrs. Henderson from across the street, she'd just pursed her lips and said, "Arthur said she went to visit her sister, indefinitely. Poor dear was always a bit frail." At the time, I'd accepted it. People move, people get sick, people have family they need to look after. But now, reading these bitter comments scrawled next to a fictional story of a lonely wife, a cold seed of unease started to sprout in my mind. She manipulates with tears. Had Mrs. Abernathy been a sad woman? Had Mr. Abernathy despised her frailty? I turned a page, my fingers clumsy. Another annotation, this one circled several times like he really wanted to emphasize it. It was next to a sentence where the fictional husband in the story felt trapped. Mr. Abernathy had written, "Escape is a necessity, not a choice. Some cages are invisible." A shiver went down my spine. Escape from what? An invisible cage? Was he talking about his own life? His own marriage? The implications were starting to feel seriously heavy. This wasn't just about a quirky neighbor with an odd habit of writing in books anymore. This was a glimpse into a mind that seemed fractured, capable of deep, unsettling bitterness. I found myself remembering little insignificant things about Mr. Abernathy. The way he meticulously deadheaded his roses, snipping off the spent blooms with almost surgical precision. The way his windows were always spotless, yet the blinds were often drawn, especially in the rooms at the back of the house. How rarely any sound came from his home. A silence that now felt less peaceful and more controlled. You know, the signs your neighbor is hiding something aren't always obvious. There was another story in the collection, a darker, more suspenseful one about a character who suspects they're being watched. Here, Mr. Abernathy's notes took on an even more disturbing quality. Observation is power. Know their routines. Know their weaknesses. The watcher sees all. The watched see only what is permitted. My skin crawled. It felt like he was describing a predator, the careful, calculating patience of someone who enjoys having a hidden advantage. Had he been watching someone? Or was this just how he interpreted the story's themes? I tried to cling to the latter, to the idea that I was just letting my imagination run wild, fueled by the eerie late-night quiet and this unsettling discovery. But the words were there, in his precise, undeniable handwriting. I remembered something else Mrs. Henderson had said, a piece of neighborhood gossip I'd dismissed at the time. Arthur's a strange one. Always has been. Keeps to himself. Too much, if you ask me. You never really know what goes on behind closed doors, do you? No, you really don't. And sometimes maybe you're better off not knowing. I thought about the book itself. He'd had it for 3 months. 3 months for these thoughts, these observations, to be meticulously written onto its pages. Had he reread it over and over? Had these dark thoughts been his constant companions during that time? The act of him returning the book, his polite, almost formal manner on my driveway that morning, now seemed cast in a completely different light. Was there a hidden meaning in that exchange? Was there some message he was trying to send, or was I just the unlucky recipient of a private diary he'd forgotten he'd kept? I flipped towards the end of the book, my search becoming more frantic. I had this desperate need to understand, to find some clue that would either confirm my growing fears or, hopefully, ease them. Maybe there was a note of explanation, an apology for the scribbles. Instead, I found something else. Tucked into the very last page, acting almost as a final chilling bookmark, was not writing, but a small rectangular slip of paper. It was thicker than the book's pages, a piece of cardstock maybe. With trembling fingers, I pulled it out. It wasn't a note. It was a photograph. A faded, slightly creased black and white photograph. The photograph was old, the kind with those serrated edges you used to see. The image was a little blurry, like it was taken by an unsteady hand or a very basic camera. It showed a woman standing in what looked like a garden. She was smiling, a wide, slightly hesitant smile, her eyes squinting a bit against a sun I couldn't see. She had dark, wavy hair and was wearing a simple, light-colored dress. Behind her, a rose bush, heavy with blooms, was clear even in black and white. My blood ran cold. I recognized that rose bush, or at least one that looked exactly like it. It was the spitting image of the prize-winning one that grew, even now, in Mr. Abernathy's perfectly kept front garden, the very same bush I'd been admiring when I offered him the book. But it wasn't the rose bush that made my breath catch in my throat, that sent a jolt of icy dread through my whole body. It was the woman. Even with the blurriness, the faded quality of the image, there was something hauntingly familiar about her face. I stared, my mind racing, trying to place her. Where had I seen that smile, that particular tilt of the head? And then, like a key turning in a rusty lock, it clicked. It was Mrs. Abernathy. Younger for sure, maybe by 20 or 30 years. Her face less etched with worry than the woman I vaguely remembered from when I first moved into the neighborhood. But it was her. The dark wavy hair, the shape of her eyes, the gentle curve of her smile. It was undeniably, terrifyingly, her. Why was this photograph hidden in my book? A book Mr. Abernathy had just returned? I turned the photograph over. The back was blank, yellowed with age. No date, no writing, nothing. My hands were shaking so badly now that the image seemed to vibrate. I laid it carefully on the coffee table as if it might shatter, or worse, as if something might crawl out of it. The room felt suddenly oppressive, the silence no longer peaceful but charged with this unspoken, unseen horror. I picked up the book again, my focus no longer on the spidery annotations but on finding anything else, any other clue that might explain this. I flipped through the pages more carefully this time, checking each one, running my fingers along the gutters, looking for anything tucked away, anything hidden. Near the middle of the book where the spine was most broken, I found another small item. This wasn't a photograph. It was a news clipping. Small, yellowed, and brittle, folded into a tiny square. My fingers fumbled as I carefully unfolded it. The print was small, the paper fragile. It was obviously very old. The headline, stark and blunt, leaped out at me. Local woman missing, foul play feared. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I scanned the short article, my eyes darting across the faded ink. It was dated, I realized with a sickening lurch, nearly 35 years ago. It described the disappearance of a young woman, a wife and mother, from a neighboring town, a town about an hour's drive from our quiet suburban street. Her car had been found abandoned near a wooded area. No signs of a struggle, but she had vanished without a trace. The article mentioned her husband, a distraught local businessman, and their young daughter. The woman's name was Eleanor Abernathy. No, it couldn't be. A wave of nausea washed over me. Eleanor Abernathy, the woman in the photograph, Mr. Abernathy's wife. The woman Mrs. Henderson had said went to visit her sister indefinitely. But this newspaper clipping wasn't from 2 years ago. It was from 3.5 decades ago. Long before I moved here. Long before Mrs. Henderson had offered her vague explanation. The implications were monstrous. If this Eleanor Abernathy, the woman in the photograph, the subject of this faded news report, was his wife, then the quiet, frail Mrs. Abernathy I'd briefly known, the one who had vanished a couple of years ago. Who was she? A different wife? A later wife? Or was the entire story of the visit to her sister a lie? A carefully constructed cover for something far more sinister that had happened much, much earlier. The pieces were starting to connect, forming this grotesque, terrifying picture. The bitter, misogynistic notes in the book, especially around the story of the unhappy wife. She manipulates with tears. Escape is a necessity. The photograph of a younger, smiling Eleanor. And now this. A news clipping about her disappearance, where foul play was feared. I thought back to Mr. Abernathy's comment that morning. The stories, they had a certain depth. What depth had he found? Had he seen his own life, his own secrets, reflected in these fictional stories? Had the act of reading, of engaging with these tales of human drama and darkness, somehow stirred something in him, prompted him to, what? Confess? Hint? Taunt? The book, my ordinary collection of short stories, had become a container for his dark past, a testament to a secret he had carried for decades, and he had, quite deliberately, returned it to me. Why? What did he expect me to do with this information? This evidence? The house suddenly felt unsafe. My proximity to Mr. Abernathy, separated only by a few feet of lawn and a picket fence, felt unbearably dangerous. His perfect flower boxes, his neatly mowed lawn, his quiet routines, they all seemed like a carefully maintained mask, hiding a monstrous reality. The man who trimmed his roses with such precision, who stuck to his schedules with unwavering rigidity, what else was he capable of controlling, of disposing of? People often let their homes fall apart when they've lost control over their own lives, but his was the opposite, an almost obsessive control. My mind replayed every interaction I'd ever had with him, searching for clues I'd missed, for warning signs I'd been too naive to see. His pale, distant eyes, his reedy voice, his reluctance to engage. Had his quietness not been shyness, but the wariness of a man guarding a terrible secret? The silence from his house. Was it the silence of a man alone, or the silence of something ended? I looked at the photograph again, at Eleanor's smiling, hopeful face, then at the news clipping, its stark, horrifying headline, and then at the book, filled with its chilling, almost invisible confessions. The pattern wasn't just unsettling anymore. It was a blueprint of a life built on a lie, a life potentially stained by an unimaginable act. And the architect of that life lived right next door. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just an old mystery. This was a present danger. Because the man who had, by all appearances, gotten away with something terrible for 35 years, was still there, still watching, still perhaps capable of anything. This is getting intense, and honestly my hands are still shaking a bit just recounting this. If you're finding this story as gripping and chilling as I did living it, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. You seriously won't want to miss how this unravels, because believe me, the worst was yet to come. And drop a comment below. What would you do in this situation? I genuinely want to know. My living room, usually my cozy sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The walls seemed to be closing in, the shadows in the corners deepening, like they were alive and watching. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded like a footstep. Like him, Mr. Abernathy, somehow knowing his carefully guarded secrets, were now splayed out on my coffee table under the harsh glare of my lamp. I couldn't breathe. I stood up, pacing the room, the book, the photograph, and the news clipping acting like this macabre vortex, pulling my gaze back again and again. What was I supposed to do? Go to the police? What would I even tell them? That my eccentric elderly neighbor returned a book with some creepy notes, a 35-year-old news clipping, and an old photo? Would they even take me seriously? Or would they just write me off as some hysterical woman with an overactive imagination, misreading the ramblings of a lonely old man? I remembered reading a story once where the police said they had no obligation to disclose what they found. Case closed. And that thought sent a chill down my spine. But this felt like more than just ramblings. This felt intentional. The way he'd handed me the book, his unusually direct gaze, his comment about its depth. It was as if he wanted me to find these things. But why? Was it a cry for help? A taunt? A test? Or was it something far more sinister? A way of implicating me, of dragging me into his dark world? My eyes fell on the book again. There had to be more. This couldn't be all of it. The unsettling pattern was there, but the final, definitive piece of the puzzle felt like it was still missing. Driven by this desperate, almost reckless need, I snatched up the book. I didn't just flip through the pages this time. I went through it page by page, scrutinizing every margin, every blank space, every crease and fold. I ran my fingertips over the paper, searching for any other hidden indentation, any other oddity. The house was dead silent except for the frantic thumping of my own heart and the rasp of my breath. Minutes stretched on forever. I was almost at the very beginning of the book. In the preface, a section I, and presumably Mr. Abernathy, would have likely just skimmed. The paper here was stiffer, less handled than the story pages. And there it was. It wasn't writing. It wasn't another photograph or clipping. It was something far more visceral, far more horrifying. Pressed so deeply into the gutter between the preface and the first page that it was almost invisible, was a single strand of hair. A long, dark, wavy strand of hair. The exact color and texture of the hair in the photograph of Eleanor Abernathy, but that wasn't the most horrifying part. Sticking to the very tip of the hair, almost microscopic, was a tiny, dark, reddish-brown fleck. A fleck that looked, to my horrified, unwilling eyes, exactly like dried blood. A strangled gasp escaped my lips. I dropped the book as if it had burned me. It landed on the floor with this sickening thud, pages splayed open like a broken bird. This was the abyss. This was the definitive, undeniable proof staring back at me, cold and damning. A single strand of hair may be kept as some grotesque trophy for 35 years. A strand of hair that could very well belong to Eleanor Abernathy. And the fleck, dear God, the fleck. It wasn't just a story anymore, not just an old mystery. This was tangible. This was real. This spoke of violence, of a life extinguished, of a secret buried not just metaphorically, but perhaps literally. The room spun. I stumbled back, knocking into the coffee table, the teacup rattling. My mind reeled, trying to process the unimaginable. Mr. Abernathy. Quiet, cardigan-wearing, rose-tending Mr. Abernathy. A man who might have killed his wife. A man who had kept this horrifying souvenir, this damning piece of evidence, and then, for reasons I couldn't even begin to guess, had deliberately placed it, along with all the other clues, into my hands. Escape is a necessity, not a choice. Some cages are invisible. His words, scrawled in the margin, now screamed with a chilling clarity. Had Eleanor tried to escape? Had her cage become too real, too unbearable? And what about the other Mrs. Abernathy? The frail woman who had disappeared a few years ago? Was she another victim? Had history repeated itself? The police showing up once or twice at a neighbor's place could just be a noise complaint. But if they were always around, it usually means something criminal. But there were never police at Mr. Abernathy's. Never. Just that impenetrable, heavy silence. My gaze was fixed on the fallen book, on that single exposed strand of hair. It was like a beacon of pure evil in my otherwise ordinary living room. The chilling discovery wasn't just a concept anymore. It was a physical manifestation of a nightmare. The realization of what I held, of what I knew, was crushing. It was a burden too heavy to bear, a secret too dark to keep. The vague unease I'd always felt about him had been this deeply buried instinct, a primal warning system trying to tell me about the monster living next door. A monster who had, for some inexplicable reason, decided to share his monstrosity with me. The normalcy of the evening, of my entire life up until that point, had shattered. It lay in iridescent, razor-sharp fragments around me. Everything I thought I knew about my quiet suburban existence, about the man who lived just a few feet away, was a lie. The truth was this book, this hair, this dark, cold abyss that had opened up beneath my feet and threatened to swallow me whole. I felt like I had brushed up against something truly evil, a dark secret that had been dormant for years. The immediate aftermath of finding that hair was a blur of adrenaline and just sheer terror. My first instinct was to run, grab my keys, get in my car, and drive as far away from that house, from him, as possible. But where would I go, and what would I say? The evidence, if you could even call it that after so many years and found in such a bizarre way, was circumstantial at best, horrifyingly compelling at worst. It was the kind of story that, if you told it wrong, could make me sound unhinged. I stared at the book on the floor. It felt like this malevolent object radiating a palpable coldness. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again, not right away. That strand of hair with its horrifying tiny fleck was seared into my brain. My mind, struggling to cope, started racing through every interaction, every tiny observation I'd ever made about Arthur Abernathy. His meticulousness, once just a sign of a tidy, elderly gentleman, now seemed like the obsessive precision of a sociopath. His reclusiveness, which I'd just put down to a desire for privacy, now felt like the calculated isolation of someone with something terrible to hide. Even the way he tended his roses, those vibrant, almost unnaturally perfect blooms, was there something sinister buried beneath them? The thought, morbid and totally out there, still took root. Had he buried his wife under the garden? It sounded like something from a cheap thriller, but in the terrifying new reality that had just crashed down around me, nothing seemed impossible. I questioned everything. My safety, my judgment. How could I have lived next to this man for 5 years and seen nothing? Or more accurately, seen things but just dismissed them? The blinds that were always drawn in certain windows, the way he sometimes seemed to watch the neighborhood, not with friendly curiosity but with this detached, almost predatory stillness, the heavy silence that often came from his house. These were all red flags, subtle maybe, but flags nonetheless, flags I had completely failed to recognize. My perception of my own home, my sanctuary, was violated. It no longer felt safe. The shared wall of my study, the one that bordered his property. Did he ever listen? The quiet evenings I'd spent reading, thinking I was in my own private world. Had he been there, just feet away, a silent, menacing presence? The thought made my skin crawl with a fresh wave of disgust. The photograph of Eleanor, her hopeful, slightly squinting smile, haunted me. She had been young. She had, according to the news clipping, a daughter. What happened to that child? Did she grow up wondering, always wondering, what became of her mother? Did she suspect her own father? The weight of that unknown history, that potential lifelong trauma, pressed down on me. And then there was the other Mrs. Abernathy, the one who disappeared more recently. Was she another Eleanor? Another victim of his invisible cage idea? The police probably wouldn't connect a 35-year-old cold case from another town with a more recent, unconfirmed disappearance based solely on my fragmented book-derived story. I felt this overwhelming sense of responsibility, but also a paralyzing fear. If I went to the authorities and they investigated, Abernathy would know it was me. He had given me the book. What would he do? He had presumably silenced at least one person, possibly two. Would he hesitate to silence a third if he felt threatened? His actions in returning the book felt like a gamble, some bizarre, high-stakes game, and I was now an unwilling player. He was clearly signaling he had something to hide. My mind kept circling back to the why. Why me? Why now? Was he old, maybe sick, and wanted his secrets to come out but didn't have the courage to confess directly? Was it some twisted form of power play, a way of showing his control, his ability to manipulate even from the shadows of his past? Or was it simply the act of a mind finally cracking under the pressure of decades of guilt? A mind so fractured that this seemed like a logical way to unburden itself. There were no easy answers, only more terrifying questions. That whole idea about the quiet magic of shared thoughts when you lend someone a book, it felt like a sick joke right then. The only thing shared here was a glimpse into a profoundly disturbed and dangerous mind. This wasn't finding a hidden message leading to treasure. This was like uncovering a potential grave. I thought about the phrase, "truth is stranger than fiction." My current reality was definitely proof of that. No novelist, no matter how good, could have cooked up a tale so bizarre, so deeply unsettling, rooted in the mundane reality of a suburban Tuesday. The trust I had in the ordinary, in the predictable surface of life, was irrevocably broken. If Mr. Abernathy, the epitome of the harmless elderly neighbor, could harbor such darkness, then who else? What other secrets lurked behind the neat facades of the houses on my street? The world suddenly felt like a much more dangerous, deceptive place. The comforting illusion of safety had been stripped away, leaving me raw and exposed. That feeling that evil often hides behind a smile felt chillingly true. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every sound was magnified. I replayed the moment he handed me the book over and over, searching his face in my memory for some sign, some flicker of his true intent. But there was nothing but that polite, unreadable mask. He had returned my book, and in doing so, he had returned a nightmare that now belonged to me. The first slivers of dawn found me still in my living room, a pale, exhausted wreck. The book lay where it had fallen, a dark stain on my rug. The photograph and the news clipping were still on the table, silent accusers. The strand of hair I knew was still nestled in the book's gutter, a horrifying punctuation mark to a story I wished I'd never read. I did what I had to do. Gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I carefully, using a pair of kitchen tongs, placed the book, the photograph, the news clipping, and by extension, the hair, into a large plastic bag. My hands shook so badly I could barely seal it. Then, I made the call. I spoke to a detective, my voice trembling, recounting what happened, trying to sound coherent, trying to convey the sheer, unadulterated horror of what I'd found. What followed was a blur. Police officers at my door. Questions. So many questions. The careful collection of the items, their serious faces, their professional detachment, a stark contrast to my frayed nerves. They listened. They took notes. They didn't dismiss me. Perhaps the tangible nature of the hair, the specificity of the old news clipping, gave my story a horrifying credibility. Mr. Abernathy was taken in for questioning. His house, that pristine colonial, was searched. I watched from my window, hidden behind the curtains, as detectives went in and out. The neighborhood buzzed with this kind of horrified curiosity. The silence that usually came from number 48 was broken by the comings and goings of official vehicles. The investigation is ongoing. They found things in his house I later heard through the strained whispers of the neighborhood grapevine. Things that backed up parts of my story. Things that pointed to a long-held obsession, a darkness carefully hidden for decades. The term cold case was mentioned. The name Eleanor Abernathy was spoken again, not just by me, but by those tasked with uncovering the truth of her disappearance 35 years ago. As for the more recent Mrs. Abernathy, the one who supposedly went to visit her sister, that too is now part of their inquiry. I still don't know what Mr. Abernathy's motives were in returning that book to me. Maybe he was, in his own twisted way, confessing. Maybe it was a final, desperate act of a man whose secrets had become too heavy. Or maybe, and this is the thought that chills me most, he simply wanted an audience for his life's dark masterpiece, a final witness to the abyss he had so carefully curated. I still live next door to that house. It's empty now, a silent, brooding monument to the secrets it held. The perfect flower boxes are beginning to wilt. The lawn is slowly getting overgrown. Sometimes, I look over, and I swear I can still see him, a shadowy figure in the window, watching. The book is gone, taken as evidence, but its story, its chilling contents are imprinted on my mind. I'll never be able to look at a borrowed book, a quiet neighbor, or even a perfectly manicured rose bush the same way again. That Tuesday, what began as a completely normal event, the return of a book, became the day the ordinary shattered, revealing the terrifying, unexpected darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface, just next door. It left me questioning everything I thought I knew, and wondering about the stories hidden behind every closed door in every quiet life. The truth, I've learned, is often far more terrifying than any fiction. This experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. If you've ever had an encounter that made you question reality, or if this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that delve into the unexpected and the unsettling. Stay safe and perhaps take a closer look at the world around you. You never know what you might find.